Welcome back. This is News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. Jazakallah so much for staying with us. Now, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa's decision to approve Eskom's retrospective electricity tariff application sparked criticism from members of Parliament. Now, NERSA recently ruled that Eskom could recover 8.1 billion rand for the 2021-2022 financial year. Now, Eskom had initially sought 23.9 billion rand through its regulatory clearing account application. The regulator approved significantly less, just under that amount of 8.1 billion rand. Now, you saw what happened yesterday in Parliament. Fiery exchanges that were happening there, especially when it came to Minister of Energy and Electricity, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, needing to answer these questions. Now, the question comes, of course, Eskom as a state utility would say we need the funding so we can keep the lights on. But then there's the consumer also at the same time who says, well, we have to dig even deeper into our pockets because this is really a massive challenge for us given the current fiscal strain within the country. Now, joining me to discuss this is the Acting Executive Manager for Electricity at NERSA, Welile Mkhize. Mr. Mkhize, good day. Thank you so much for joining us on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Thank you so much, Mr. Faraz. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Right. Mr. Mkhize, talk to us about the requirements from Eskom that NERSA needs to improve, or it needs to approve, I beg your pardon, in terms of any supposed price hike.
Yeah, so thank you for having us, Faraz. Just want to maybe give a bit of a background on what NERSA does and why we exist, probably for the sake of the listeners. NERSA is established as per the National Energy Regulator Act, and we exist to basically do three things. And that is to regulate electricity, to regulate gas pipelines, as well as petroleum pipelines. So this evening, we want to look specifically at the electricity department, or what electricity does in terms of regulation. So basically, the requirements when it comes to Eskom's applications is that we have to firstly comply with the Act, which is the Electricity Regulations Act. We have to also receive a complete application from Eskom, which is in line with our pricing methodology, as well as the Act. And then also this application must be on time so that we can be able to process the application before certain legislative dates which are required by law. So those are the main requirements. Obviously, the application must also be in compliance with what we call the minimum requirements for tariff applications. I'll stop there for us.
Right. Now, feasibility studies and those models, of course, are quite important. Now, how do they come into effect, especially one when it comes to the financial strategy? So how does Eskom, for example, I mean, they wanted originally 23.9 billion rand, and of course, NERSA, through whatever variables or models that they use, said, well, we can only give you 8.1. So how does something like that occur when NERSA is determining how much of funding is actually needed to be given to Eskom?
All right, so Faraz, we look at a plethora of factors when deciding on Eskom's revenue application. Remember, the first part of the application is determining the size of revenue that Eskom can collect from its customers. Now, when we look at that, the first thing we look at is the cost base that Eskom applies based on a number of costs, including operational costs, maintenance, the return on their assets, several other costs that are presented by Eskom to the regulator to consider. So we do what we call a prudency assessment meaning that the costs must be in line with some prudency tests. So in other words, if a certain cost is above a certain level, then the regulator is able to disallow that portion of the cost that is above what is reasonable according to our prudency guidelines. So once those various cost elements have been determined to be efficient, because remember Section 15 of the Act says that NERSA needs to approve revenues that are based on costs that are efficient. So we do those efficiency tests. So once that is done, the total revenue, including a reasonable margin, which is a reasonable return on its assets based on the risk that is perceived, we then, we know we have so much revenues that Eskom needs to recover from its customers, and that revenue is obviously then efficient based on the assessments that we have done to ensure efficiency tests are observed.
Mr. Mkhize, inflation, and I want to touch on the 2021-2022 financial year because, of course, this is the topic in discussion. How does variables like that, when we look at the inflation that was then, of course, and it was sitting around the 5% mark, it's of course come down to 4.4% just this week before the SARB decision. But when we looked at, obviously, that financial year, it was still in the midst of COVID-19, and there was still load shedding that was happening with the various stages, even if it was a bit lower at that time. But how does that come into effect when determining that multi-year price determination methodology? Explain that to us, please.
Okay, so the methodology prescribes areas where the costs are linked to inflation. For example, operating costs are largely linked to inflation. There are some costs that are not necessarily linked or dependent on the inflation rates at the time. For example, your primary energy, when it comes to coal, the price of coal is obviously determined by the market. And so that is not necessarily linked. It's not always linked to inflation. So to be specific, the methodology prescribes that inflation is linked to operating costs. So we look at those costs in terms of inflation. So we cannot allow operating costs to go beyond the rate of inflation at the time.
Mr. Mkhize, let's touch on the regulatory clearing account, and I want to spend some time on that. So yesterday, the DA argued in Parliament that the RCA adjustments are complex and it's not easily understood by consumers and businesses. Now, I tried to understand it to prepare for this interview. I still haven't gotten a grasp of it. So it's a two-part question. If you could maybe explain just those RCA adjustments and how does Eskom present this through its application, and how does a man and a woman on the street understand this? Because at the end of the day, it is the citizen of South Africa that's paying for it, but they don't understand really it's the funding model or the accountancy model that comes into question. So I'm going to give you some time just to maybe explain that and how someone on the street can maybe understand this so that they can have a determination as to how supposedly Eskom presents this application, which you, NERSA, either approve or reject.
Yeah, so for us, all our decisions of the regulator are published on our website. So if, for example, one wants to get a better understanding of the reasons behind a decision that the regulator has made, we do have what we call our reasons for decision that we publish. So those can be accessed on our website. But just briefly, with regards to RCA, this is what we call the regulatory clearing account, which basically looks to adjusting whatever that in terms of revenues. Remember, we said initially that we allocate a certain amount of revenue for Eskom to be able to recover through its tariffs. But you will find that that revenue is either going to be slightly more or less than what is actually recovered by the utility. So the purpose of the RCA is to look at what was approved versus what actually transpired. So it's a backward-looking mechanism. So if Eskom overspent on any of its cost items, then consumers are sort of credited, so to speak, through the tariff. But if Eskom tended to underestimate its costs, we then obviously then credit Eskom so that they don't become revenue deficient. So that is the mechanism for basically adjusting everything back to what it should be. It's almost the same as what SARS does. So you get taxed during the year. At the end of the year, you need to provide proof that shows your expenditure versus what SARS taxed you. So if whatever that you received is more than what SARS taxed you, then you'd have to pay in. But if whatever you were taxed is less than what your income was for the financial year, then SARS will then give you back a refund, or so to speak. So this is a similar mechanism that we use to ensure that Eskom's revenues are not over nor under the approved revenues by the regulator.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Welile Mkhize. At the end of the day, it is, of course, the man or the woman on the street that has to fund this through the tariffs that, of course, are charged by municipalities. But how much of a public participation do citizens have in this determination of what the tariff should be? After the break, I continue my conversation with Mr. Mkhize in discussing public participation. Do stay tuned to News in Focus. Welcome back to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. Thank you again for staying with us, Mr. Mkhize. Mr. Mkhize, of course, is from NERSA and he serves as the Acting Executive Manager for Electricity. Now, Mr. Mkhize, whenever Eskom applies to NERSA, I mean, I hear it on the radio stations, I hear it in the public. It's sort of like NERSA is the Freddy Krueger and Eskom is the Hannibal Lecter, and they sometimes really don't care what the citizens think. And that's, of course, what the perception is among citizens. And sometimes one may understand because things are really tight from a financial perspective. Now, how much public participation occurs in times like this, given that, like I've mentioned, you've got a tight fiscus and citizens really want to manage their money quite carefully. And probably the last thing they want to do is spend 20% or 25% of their revenue a month on electricity. So talk to us about this public participation process, please.
Okay, thank you for that question for us. So basically, all of these processes for us are governed by the law. So whenever a public institution like NERSA or a public entity like NERSA has to make a decision, this affects a number of people, obviously almost everyone in the Republic. So we have a law that is called PAJA, which is a public administrative guideline or law, an act of Parliament, which then says that if we have to make a decision that's going to affect certain people, what we call interested and affected persons, then those persons need to be consulted before the regulator exercises its power to decide on tariffs in this case. So what we do, Faraz, is we do consult the public via various means. So what we do is we look at the provinces in the country whenever a decision is going to be made, and a consultation paper has been issued to the public for its consumption or for its reading to understand what Eskom has applied for, the amounts in terms of revenues and so on. We then go out to the public to consult. It's either going to be online or it's going to be face-to-face, depending on the response that we got per province. So if, for example, we get huge response in KZN, then we make it a point to make sure that we do a public participation process that is face-to-face to accommodate everyone so that they can be able to attend such an event. However, if we find in a certain province that there isn't so much interest via the notice and comment process, where obviously we have a two-part process. Maybe let me put it like this, go backwards a bit. So the first part is where we issue the summary or the consultation paper that contains all the information regarding the application. So that is published on our website, and then we get comments from the public based on the questions that are asked in the consultation paper. So if we see that there's a lot of interest, then we do a face-to-face in a particular province. If we notice that there isn't much interest in a particular province, then we normally do it online. We do a public participation process online. That is just to ensure that we utilize our very scarce resources effectively. So we respond based on the response that we get from the public. So once all those comments from the public have been received, we then use those comments as well as all the facts presented by both Eskom as well as socioeconomic factors that we have to consider. We take all of those that information to make the final decision in terms of the tariff that Eskom then is able to implement. So that is the process for us.
Mr. Mkhize, I mean, you know the saying, you're getting caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, it gets thrown around loosely, but NERSA is clearly in that scenario now. I mean, how do you find middle ground in terms of listening to both Eskom and the consumers? Because you've got a power utility that is in the red and they're applying that pressure. But then you've also got consumers who are saying, look here, it's just ridiculous for us to now go ahead and pay even more. Like, for example, in the city of Johannesburg, where, of course, prepaid customers now have to pay. Well, it was in, of course, discussion for this 120 Rand extra surcharge. So talk to us about that, because you know, you're trying to satisfy both. It's not really always going to be the case.
Yeah, look, for us, the regulator is governed by law. So there is always going to be a lot of noise around us from the public as well as from the utility itself. And I'm not referring it to noise that we don't listen. But what I'm saying is we focus on implementing the provisions of the law. So Eskom by law has to apply for tariffs. I don't want to call it tariff increases, because it sounds as if it always has to be an increase. It doesn't always have to be an increase. So by law, they have to apply for tariffs on an annual basis. And that is to ensure that whatever they are charging customers is in line with what revenues they require to stay as a going concern, as a business. So this should not be looked in a negative sense to say that every year Eskom applies for an increase. All that is happening is Eskom applies for revenues in order to implement new tariffs to make sure that it is not over-recovering, neither is it under-recovering. So, having said that, ours is to focus on doing what the law requires of us, which, as I said earlier, is to analyze Eskom's costs, make sure that their costs are in line with inflation, with benchmarks, even in terms of other utilities, are they spending what is in line with acceptable norms and standards? If they are not, then there are adjustments downwards. But obviously, as we know, for us, things are always going up. Inflation, because of inflation, because of other factors, the salaries have to increase. Eskom has got people in its employ. So mostly costs will go up on an annual basis. So we have to take those into account when determining the final revenues that Eskom can collect from its customers. So it's not that we are not listening to customers. It's not that we are not listening to all the other stakeholders, but we are simply implementing the work that the requirements as per the Act, and we are making sure that Eskom stays a going concern, a business that is worth, its salt, so to speak. It's a going concern. It has the ability to meet its costs as and when those costs arise.
I was listening on the radio station. I want to touch on that when you mentioned stakeholders. I was listening this morning on the way to work, and there was one caller on the radio station that said that paying customers, because there are a lot of customers that don't pay, that actually do illegal connection of electricity, which is quite a shame. But they would argue that, look, it's a necessity because we don't have electricity, we don't have the money. With regards to stakeholders, I mean, how important is an organization like SALGA and also the municipality? Because at the end of the day, it's the municipality that, of course, determines the ultimate price of what you pay per kilowatt. So how much of that dialogue is there with those stakeholders? Because at the end of the day, especially the municipality, that's where the buck stops in terms of the actual pricing of what you pay per kilowatt.
Okay, so in terms of municipalities, they also apply for their tariff increases, just like Eskom does. And the purpose for that is the same, is to make sure that their costs are not above or over and above what they require to run their business effectively. So whatever tariffs that municipalities charge, the regulator has then approved those tariffs. Obviously, there's a difference between tariffs and prices when it comes to municipalities in particular. We determine the tariff, which is the cost the cost for producing electricity. But the actual price that the consumer pays also has other surcharges that the municipality is allowed to charge as per what council approves, which is also governed by the MFMA, which is the Municipal Finance Management Act. So all of this for us is governed by the law. And we do admit that part of what, the consumer, part of what they pay has got an element of certain inefficiencies. Of course, municipalities do have certain issues in terms of losses on their power lines and so on. But to a large extent, what the customer pays is what it costs the municipality to provide electricity to their household or to the business facility and so on.
Mr. Mkhize, we've got just a minute. I'm just going to have to ask my director if I can just get you to answer just this last question, please. MK Party member Brian Molefe, he made suggestions that there should be a regulation of the price of coal rather than the regulation of electricity. He said that should come into effect. Is that possible? Is there a possibility for this to be achieved, regulation of the actual resources that provides the electricity? In 1 minute, please, Mr. Mkhize.
Look, I can't comment so much on what Mr. Molefe has said. He has his views, but obviously that's a policy decision. That's a decision that politicians would have to make. Ours is to implement policy decisions. So whatever that government decides when it comes to issues like that, it will then have to translate to some act. We particularly are guided by the Electricity Regulations Act. So if that suggestion becomes law, then we would then have to implement that law. However, when it comes to policy decisions, we don't enter into that realm.
Mr. Welile Mkhize, thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Thank you for us.
No, absolute
Much
pleasure. That's
appreciated.
Welile Mkhize. He serves as the Acting Executive Manager for Electricity at NERSA. Well, the good news for this weekend, even though it's cold everywhere in South Africa, is that Eskom says the lights will be kept on. But they've now asked for 23.9 billion. It's now brought down to 8.1 billion rand. There's still 2 more financial years that Eskom needs to look into. The 2 financial years has seen new leadership come within the power utility. Are they going to be going back for more? Or will there be some sort of difference in financial strategies with regards to the power utility? We are moving closer to the 200 days of no load shedding. Hopefully the next 2 financial years will allow for there either to be maybe them not going for that application or for them going for the application but with a lower request. So that's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Ross Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.